Hello there, this is Russ Bucher from ControlMyNikon, and in this video we're going to take a look at how to use live view in the ControlMyNikon program. Now, live view is very useful when you're tethered because you could see the live view image in a much larger format, such as on your monitor. So it's a little bit better than having to look down at the small LCD panel on the back of your camera body. So let's see how we use it. The first thing we need to do is to get connected to the camera. So I have a Nikon D800 hooked up here, and I'm going to press the connect button. And you can see now that we are connected. And now to turn on live view, all you need to do is go over to the live view button and click on it. Now this is a scene I've set up of a small magnetic model. So these are all little magnetic blocks here. And we're going to take some shots of this and explore how to use the live view functionality. And as you can see here, the model is inside a light box, and this will let us have a good high key composition. And we have a lot of illumination. Now, one of the first things you can do live view is you can autofocus. So all you need to do to autofocus is click on this button up here, and it will drive the contrast autofocus functionality of the body. Now, if this box turns green, and before when we came in it was red, but if it turns green, then that means that it has achieved focus. Now, the body thinks it's achieved focus, but once you look closely, you may decide, well, maybe it's not as in focus as it could be, but you can always tweak the focus here with these different buttons. So let's take a closer look at the autofocus functionality. So again, we can just click on it, and it autofocuses. And you can see while the autofocus is running, that the box turns a bit of an orange color. That means it's searching. Now, to get a successful autofocus, the body needs to have good lighting and great contrast. This focus box defines what area of the screen will receive the focus command. So here we have some pretty good contrast and lighting, so it was pretty easy to get a focus here. And we could try here, again, good contrast. No problem. But what happens if we go over here? Now, let's move the box over here, and to move it, all you need to do is left click. Now when you move it initially, all you've done is moved the focus box, and this box is also used for zooming in. Now if you want to focus, you can either click on this button again, or you could just double click. So here it searched, and it thought it found focus. And I think all it found was a little bit of detail in the material at the back of the light box. So if I try double clicking anywhere, it has great difficulty in getting away from that focus. Oh, there we go. Now we finally had an area of high enough contrast to bring it back. So you try it again, and off it goes. So hunting can be a problem, and sometimes you'll go to focus and you'll get stuck in an area here. It just won't come back. It's like this. I mean, we know there's these little chrome balls and these cylinders here, but from what it's looking at here, the body has determined that it will not attempt to cycle the complete range of the focus to find it. So we can use these buttons up at the top of the screen to advance the focus. Now this button here means to bring the focus closer to you coarsely, so by a large amount. So I'm going to click on it, click again, again, again. And now it's come into focus. Now there's a smaller version of this, which is here. So this is coarse, and this is fine. Now these two buttons go in the opposite direction. So fine and fine. So you're basically adjusting the focus in and out. And you can go further as well. So this button here brings the focus nearer to the camera. And this button here brings it further away. Now the amount of focus that it moves for these buttons is set up here. If we go to the View menu and down to Layers, this is where we control a lot of the settings for live view. So if we go down to Focus Step, you'll find there's a setting for Step Fine and Step Coarse. And generally on a Nikon body, you can keep it around 50 for a fine setting. The smaller the number, is the smaller amount of focus changes when you press the button. So if I have fine, here it's moving step 50 every time I press it, no matter which direction I go. If I increase it, you can see it changes a lot. So it's a good idea to set up a good fine and coarse amount. Now this varies per body and lens a little bit. So this particular lens is the Nikon 105mm VR macro lens, and it works pretty good at a fine step of 50 and a coarse of about 150. So we'll go fine, coarse, fine, coarse. So, and the coarse buttons are there just to allow you to move throughout the focus range a little faster. Now this focus box can also be hidden, and to hide it you just go here under the Layers tab and take away this check mark and it's gone. And you may want to do that if it's just getting in the way while you're composing, and you can also click here to bring it back. You could change the opacity of it as well so it becomes very faint. Really depends on your workflow and your composition. Now you can turn that off as well with this button. This is a hide layers button. All these functions you see here under layers are basically different layers that sit on top of the live view image, and we'll be using that to display different data such as the focus box. And sometimes you can get so much data overlaying your image it's tough to see the image, so you can just click on this button here to hide all the layers. Click on it again to bring it back up. Okay, we'll leave the focus box there. Now let's also take a look at the zoom. Now the zooming happens with these buttons right here. And you have 4 different levels of zoom. And by default, the zoom level is 1, so that's 100%. So if I go to 2, it zooms in, and again, and again. Now it will zoom in on the area underneath the focus box. So when you're moving this box around just by left clicking, you're not only moving where it will autofocus to, but also where it will zoom to. So let's click back up here. Let's say I want to zoom in on this intersection of these 2 objects. Now the first time I zoom in, you'll see that it really didn't zoom in on that spot at all because it was back up here. The reason for that, and I'll just zoom out for a moment, is that there's not enough data up near the top edge of the image for it to be zoomed in without cropping it in the body. So the body makes a decision and says, hey, I can't get that close to the edge to zoom in at this particular zoom level, so I'm just going to come close to it. So let's go to the 3rd level of zoom. And on this one, no problem. Because it's zoomed at a high level, it doesn't come near the edge of the image. And so it's able to achieve the target underneath the focus box. And let's try the 4th level. Okay, so it's practically right down to the pixel level at that point. For most Nikon bodies, the most useful zoom levels are really level 2 and 3, and 4 is usually just too much. I mean, really the reason you might want to zoom in is to ensure that you're in focus. So let's try using zoom to ensure that we've focused properly on this part right here. So maybe I want my focus to be on the leading edge or the nearest point of this cylinder. Zoom in one time. And you can see it has a bit of texture to it. Zoom in again, and now we can see it a little bit. So I'm going to double click here and force it to focus. Double click again, and that one's a little better than the last one, I think. I can double click again, and you can see how it varies. I'm double clicking pretty well on the same spot every time and getting varying results. So this is why when you use the autofocus, you might want to zoom in a little bit and just confirm that it did a good job. So I'm going to try autofocusing again and getting a bad result. So this was a bad result here. I mean, there was a lot of detail here, but it just failed. And this is really an issue with how the autofocus works on the body. So, but luckily, we do have focus adjustments here. So if we use these buttons here, let's try to bring it into focus. Use this one, that's the wrong direction. This one, that's pretty good. But it's pretty coarse. It's like I'm skipping over what might be the optimum focus. So I'll go to layers here, and I'm going to bring my fine down further. On the Nikon lenses, about the lowest practical focus step is about 7 or 8. Anything less than that, it really doesn't move. So let's go, say 17. Now it's moving a very small amount. Let's see if we can find the best focus. I'd say this is the correct focus, and you can see as we manually adjusted the focus, this box went red, and which really indicates that the focus is unknown at this point to the body. The body can't know when we're manually moving the focus if it is in focus. So always worthwhile to zoom in and confirm that the focus is good. And I'll zoom back out. So, as I mentioned before, just left clicking once anywhere on the screen moves this box, but you can also move this box around using the keyboard. Now you can assign keyboard shortcuts to move this box around and perform other common live view functions. Let's go over to the Tools menu and Shortcuts. And here we have a list of all the different actions that you can assign keys to. You can connect and disconnect and shoot and do a bunch of things, but let's take a look at the live view options. And those start with LV. So I could assign a key to enable or disable live view, or to toggle it, or to cause an autofocus. But I've assigned keys for changing the focus, which is those 4 focus buttons up at the top here. And these are on my numeric keypad. Now I had to set these. These don't come default when you install ControlMyNikon. And I'm going to use the buttons 1, 2, 3, and 4 on my keypad to change the zoom. Now these aren't the numeric keypads one. You can tell which ones are the numeric keypad because they start with an N. And to actually move this box around, I'm going to use the W for up, S down, D right, and A left. And for more information on keyboard shortcuts, check out our keyboard shortcuts tutorial. Okay, so I'm going to close this. And before we get started on using those shortcuts, I'd just like to point out this bar over here. Now this is the remaining live view time bar. The body firmware ensures that live view can only be on for a certain length of time. And this is normally configured under the LCD menu under auto timers on the body. And quite often by default, it'll be set to turn off live view in 10 minutes. But you can increase usually to 30 minutes, and the newer bodies can go an unlimited amount of time in live view, providing, of course, you have enough power to the camera. Bodies that don't allow an unlimited amount of time in live view always had concerns with overheating of the sensor. So if you leave live view on for a long time, the body itself has to do a lot of processing, and the body warms up, and it warms the sensor up, and you get more noise. So you could be trying to take a shot in the middle of your live view with a very warm sensor, and you get a lot of noise in it. So the body says after a certain amount of time, we're just going to shut down live view and assume that you'll let it cool off a little bit and start live view back up. Now over in the Tools menu, under Preferences, in the Live View tab, we have a place here where you could tell it to automatically restart after it shuts down, because you could be in a model shoot or a product shoot of some kind, and you don't want this thing to always be shutting down. And well, we can't necessarily prevent it from shutting down other than setting the timeout time on the body for the longest amount of time. You can tell ControlMyNikon to start it back up again. So here we could tell it to restart live view, say after a 10-second delay. Okay, so this might shut down on us as we are using it. Okay, where were we? Oh yes, the focus box. So now I have assigned keyboard shortcuts to move the focus box. So I'm going to try pressing the A key, which should bring it to the left. And there it goes. And the D key, down and up. Now this isn't terribly useful when you're completely zoomed out, but if you're zoomed in, you can now use it to pan, because the body always tries to keep the box in the middle. And if I zoom in all the way, you may find that once you're zoomed in all the way, that the panning is a little fast. Now you could change that, just going back to the Tools menu and Preferences and Live View, and here is the key pan rate. So the further I put it to the right, the faster it goes. Put it to the left and it goes a little slower. So that should be a little better. Okay, I'll bring it back to this level of zoom. Now, I'd just like to point out that if you have 3D Connections Space Mouse, or any of its similar peripherals sold by 3D Connection, you can use that as a joystick to move around here as well. And the way you could figure that is go to the Preferences, Live View, and here you can disable it, and by default it's disabled. You can use it as a joystick for panning, or you can use it as a joystick for focusing. And it's actually not too bad. So if you happen to have that, you could give it a try. Okay, now I also had set some keys to adjust focus. So on my numeric keypad, that was a 4 and 6 to zoom in and out, fine, and the 7 to zoom out coarse, and 9 to zoom in coarse. So if you are needing to adjust focus a lot, it's a good idea to set keyboard shortcuts for panning and adjusting focus. Okay, I'm just going to use my keyboard now and press 1 to zoom back out. Okay, let's take a look at some of the other functions that we have here. Next one is the histogram. So if we click on this, it turns on a histogram for this particular scene. Now, not all bodies are able to do this properly. Only those bodies that are able to show live view with a true exposure can do this. So in a body like a D600 or a D610, when you go into live view, the body will attempt to brighten or darken the live view image so you can at least see something in it. So if it's a very dark scene, it'll brighten it quite a bit. You'll be able to see, but there'll be a lot of noise. If it's a really bright scene, he'll darken it down a bit, And so it's not really representative of the actual exposure conditions out there. And then the histogram here will be incorrect, because the histogram here is created with the actual image data that you see here. The D800, on the other hand, which I'm using now, will allow you to, in manual mode, see the full correct exposure. And here, as you saw on the small inset I had here showing how this is composed, I have a ton of lighting on this. If I didn't have a lot of lighting, this would be very dark. Okay, so I'm just going to turn off the histogram. Now you can also record, and we'll have a separate tutorial video on recording video. Basically how it works is you just need to ensure that your body is set up in video mode. On a body like the D800, there's a little lever on the back. You need to flip that from live view still mode to live view video mode. And then you can press this button up here and it'll start recording. And it will automatically transfer the completed video over once the recording session is complete. Now another feature is accessible through a right click. So if you right click here anywhere on the live view screen, you have a show monitor. Let's click on that, and that brings up an additional window. And this is basically the same image as you see here, except it won't show any of the layers. And I'll just give you an example of that. Let's say we have the monitor window here, and I'm just going to turn on some layers. And we'll take a look at all these other layers here soon. So we have grids, we have inner and outer exposure settings. And these are all layers that overlay on top of the image. I could turn those off by clicking on this. But you could see the monitor does not include any of that information. So this is good, you know, if you have a focus puller or you need to move this onto another monitor for clients so they can view what you're currently looking at in live view, but without them having to look at this more cluttered screen here. Okay, I'm going to close this and I'll turn off some of these layers. So let's take a look at some of the other settings that are related to live view. I'm going to go back to the Preferences screen, so Tools menu, Preferences, and we'll go to Live View. Now we have some different numbers that we can use here, and this is the live view toggle delay, and it's set to 2000 milliseconds, which is the same as 2 seconds. This provides an additional 2-second delay every time live view is turned on and off on some older bodies. And some of those older bodies don't react very well when you turn live view on and off very quickly, or when you're capturing images, because in those older bodies, say like a D7000 or a D300, the body would actually shut down live view, then capture the image, and then it would return back to live view. And so this provides some flexibility to increase the amount of time between those actions. So if you find that when you're trying to transition between live view off and back on, maybe it locks up or it just stops communicating with the camera, or during live view it does the same thing, try increasing this timing value. Now some lenses have the same kind of problem. This lens I'm using now is just a 105mm Nikon VR macro lens. It's very fast, very good. So it can change focus extremely quickly. It can never change as fast as we can send commands to it with the computer though. So this delay allows you to slow those commands down. And right now by default it's 150 milliseconds, which is around 1/8 of a second. So we'll send focus commands to this particular lens at 1/8 second intervals. If it goes any faster, the focus attempt may fail, but the body doesn't let us know it's failed. It's just the way the Nikon SDK works. So then we lose track in the program of whether a focus was achieved or whether the focus moved at all. If you find that when you're trying to change focus, maybe with these buttons up here, or maybe in focus stacking, it doesn't change the focus. Try increasing this number. Lenses like my 50mm 1.8, which has still the screw drive type of focus mechanism, can't focus very fast at all. 150 milliseconds is way too fast for it, and I typically set that about 700 or 800 milliseconds. But not all lenses can do that, and specifically third-party lenses such as Sigmas and Takinas, they'll have some excellent lenses. However, they have not completely cloned or duplicated the CPU-controlled focus motor in there. When the Nikon body sends commands to it to adjust the focus, the lens will not respond. So if you have a Nikon lens, it's likely going to work. If you have a third-party lens, it might work. So let's take a look at some of the other functionality in live view. And of course, you can capture an image in live view, and to do that, all you need to do is press this button. And this is a capture without autofocus, so it's not going to attempt autofocus at all. You'll notice these two buttons are grayed out. Can't use them because these are autofocus only and autofocus and shoot buttons. But the autofocus used here is phase autofocus, which is different from the live view's contrast autofocus. A phase autofocus is only used when the body is not in live view. So we just disable those completely. So if you want to capture an image, you just click on this button, or you can map a keyboard shortcut to it using the shortcuts. Okay, I've just put a fresh battery in the D800. Now let's take a look at the image that we captured. To see the image, you just click on the browser button, and it shows our thumbnail down here and the final image. I'm just going to double click here to bring up the image magnifier, and you can see that it's pretty well in focus, just like we set it up in live view. And you can see the information we have set up here. I'm going to just remove some of that information so we could see the thumbnail, the histogram, and the file name. Okay, so there's one shot. So let's go back into live view. So you click on live view. Now to flip back and forth between the browser and live view, you just go browser and live view. You can use these buttons, or you can use a keyboard shortcut that you set up in the shortcut screen. So I have already set that up, and by default it's the space bar. So use space, space, and it brings you back and forth. And you want to be able to do this quickly, because normally after you capture a shot in live view, you want to see, did you capture it okay? And you need that image browser quickly. The other option is to detach the image browser, and you can actually move the image browser off to another monitor. And we have another tutorial video showing how to use the image browser. Okay, so back into live view. Now at any time when you want to close live view, you just click on the close button. Turn it on, back in. Close it like this. But once it's on and you need to use the image browser, you can just flip back and forth using these buttons or the space bar. Okay, let's capture another image. This time I'm going to adjust the focus and try to capture this intersection down here. So autofocus got me something, but I'm going to use the other focus adjustments here to take a closer look at it. I'll zoom in, and I'd just like to be able to see this shadowed area here. Okay, this looks good, and I'll capture. Now, after you've captured an image, when you're zoomed in like that, it will return the zoom to 0. But you see the button still pressed here. You can just set it back to 1, and then later you can zoom back in on it. Let's look at the browser and check the image. And you can see here, because I have synchronization set, that it automatically selected the most recently captured image. So if I look at this image, you can see where we had focused here. This image we had focused here. And let's go back in live view and capture another. And I'll just use autofocus to ensure it's in focus. Close enough for now. Click on the capture button, and check it out in the browser, and now you can see this is in focus. And you can use your mouse wheel here on the thumb strip just to navigate between these different images. Okay, looks good. Let's go back into live view. You notice that we have a shoot button here and a shoot button here. Well, the reason we have one here is because the live view is its own separate window if you want it to be. So I can go here under the view menu and go live view detached, and now it's detached. You could do the same thing with the browser and have two separate windows for the browser and live view. And you could take one of these and move it off to another monitor, take another one, move it to the other monitor. It's really up to you. You might be using, and I'm just going to reattach the browser here, you could be using live view in a separate monitor. And that's real handy because then you could see live view and then you immediately see on the main monitor in the image browser what you've just captured. Sometimes in a lab or studio situation, you could just move this window off to a separate monitor, and you might have that monitor very close to your composition, maybe sitting on the table by your subject, and then you could just press this shoot button there without having to go back to your main computer monitor. But another use for it is, and I'm just going to reattach it here, is when you hide the main ControlMyNikon panel. So if you double click here on the splitter, now you get live view full screen. Now you have a button to capture because the other button is hidden. And if you use a spacebar, you can flip between the browser and the live view window. So here we have essentially live view almost full screen. The problem though is that live view is a very low quality image. This image you're looking at here comes from a camera with a very high resolution. Like the D800 has a 7360 by 4912 resolution. That's the resolution of the finished captured image. Right? You could even see the lights reflecting here on this ball. But in live view here, all the body sends us is a JPEG, and it's a low quality JPEG. It's like normal quality. The resolution of the JPEG is only 640 by 426. It's very small. It's almost too small to put on a web page. It has a lot of artifacts in it. And if you look really close, and let's take a look up here. I'm looking at this ball and I seem to see a little ring around it. What is this up here? So it's not uncommon when you really have the live view window at a larger size that you will see more compression artifacts. And they'll just look like fringing or almost like a halo around some objects, and it can be quite distracting. Now, unfortunately, there's no workaround for this. This is the data that the body and the body firmware provides us, so we can only work with a 640 by 426 live view image. Okay, I'm going to bring back the main ControlMyNikon panel. I'll double click here. Now let's take a closer look at the different layers of data that you can overlay on top of live view. First thing we do is we could turn this layers tab on and off here under the view menu. So it's on. If I want to turn it off, I can do it like that. Turn it back on, view menu, and click on layers. Now the first thing we see here is the image section. And well, we can actually turn the image off if you wanted to. And there's a good reason to do that later on, because if you wanted to, you could still overlay information. So if you wanted to put on a grid and see the exposure information, you could do that. If you wanted to see what areas were in focus, you could do that as well. So that allows you to really isolate the source live view image with the overlaid data. And I'll turn it back on. Now, instead of just hiding it completely, you could change the opacity of it. So you can just remove it a little bit. And you can see the background goes gray. Now, the background is controlled by this setting here. And you can see now on the sides, there's a bit of a checkerboard pattern. I'm just going to resize this. And you can see the background is no longer black. If I turn the background on, here it is. Now if I want to change the color of the background, you just need to click in this color strip. So you click, hold the left mouse button down, and find a color that's good for you. I just normally leave it black. This background color will change also with the theme, but it's going to be black here. We'll turn this background back on. And now let's take a look at grayscale. So you can turn the source image gray. I'll just turn all these layers off. Now the grayscale is useful if you want to also overlay information onto it. So here, without it being grayscale, it's a bit of a goldish yellowish tinge to it. I'm going to turn it grayscale, which will make it easier for me to see this. Sometimes on a very lively scene where you have a lot of colors, it can be very difficult to see this overlay data. So you can just turn the image grayscale. Now you can also set it to copy stand mode. And what copy stand mode means is that this live view image is mirrored and flipped. So it allows you in a copy stand situation to move the camera or the subject around in a very easy manner. Let's imagine you have your camera on a copy stand and you're shooting straight down at a piece of paper with some writing on it. If you have live view on at that time and you want to maybe move the paper around a little bit to make it centered maybe in live view, you'll go in and move that piece of paper, but when you move it one way, it moves the opposite direction you expected. Okay, because everything's kind of mirrored and upside down. But when you turn it to copy stand mode, it will take the image and flip it and rotate it for you. Now, when you move that piece of paper or the camera around, it's going to move as you would expect. Okay, next thing to look at is a save on capture. So if I put a check mark here by save on capture, when you capture an image, an additional file will be created of what you saw on live view at the time when you captured the image. If you were going to capture, say, into a JPEG, which we are here, and you shoot, if you have this check mark here, it also saved an additional bitmap of what I saw here. And that can be useful as a reference to see what you saw in live view at the time of the shot. So I'm going to go to take a look at what we just saved here. Now this is the image we just saved, 0003. Okay, now we also have this 0003 LVBMP image, and really that's just live view bitmap. In fact, if I change this extension a little bit, you'll see that it is a bitmap, and it's a bitmap of the 640 by 426 image. See, if we look down here, 640 by 426, that is the live view representation of the main image, which is huge when we shot it. So you might ask, why would you want to have this live view bitmap? Well, it can be used to do further processing and do historical shots. So perhaps you might want to take a shot and then move the scene a little bit and then take another shot, then move the scene and take another. You could take this bitmap and convert it to a JPEG and use it as an overlay. Or you can just use this JPEG here, or you can use this bitmap just as a future reference as to what you saw when you took the shot. But the real main reason we use it is for stop motion photography. And I'm just going to close this for a moment and disable that and go up to workflows. So we have stop motion here, which allows you to create a stop motion set of images for creating stop motion video. And every time you take a shot in live view, when you use a stop motion workflow, it'll also capture one of those LVBMP images. And that allows you to quickly cycle through your captured images because we're only needing to show 640 by 426 images instead of these other massive images. And so it allows us to really scroll through them quickly, and it allows us to overlay those back on what you're currently seeing in live view. And that allows you to line up precisely your stop motion video shots. And we'll be doing an additional video tutorial on doing stop motion. We'll be doing that exact thing. So I'm just going to close my workflow here. And let's go back to layers. Okay, so we've turned that off. So we've seen what opacity can do. Now we can also use rotation. And when we set it to auto, it will use whatever rotation is detected by the body. And that works really good, if it's level or you're holding it, 90 degrees to the left or 90 degrees to the right for portrait shots. But if you hold it upside down, or you hold the body so it's pointing straight down in a copy stand mode, the body can get very confused. It doesn't know what direction it's pointing, and even the new cameras from Nikon don't know when they're upside down. If you have your body set up and it is reporting the rotation incorrectly, you can override it. So you can have it set to auto. It'll use whatever comes from the body. Or you could say, no, it's wrong. It actually should be this way. So that's counterclockwise, clockwise, inverted, and I'll go back to level. So it's really just a way to override the rotation information that the body has sent you. Now this cropping is used mainly on the older bodies that initially shot video. And on those bodies, the video is not automatically cropped by the body during live view. So you could be shooting maybe video on a D7000, and you're really shooting in a video format by 16:9. So the live view image coming from the D7000 would not show the correct aspect ratio, and you really couldn't frame your scene properly. So this really adds an additional crop to it. But the newer bodies, like a D800, automatically show that cropped information. So when you shoot video on the D800 and it's a 16:9 format, it'll show that here right in live view, and you don't need to make a change here at all. So you just leave it set to auto. Okay, let's see what we have. Now to hide these boxes here, you just click on them. And we talked about the focus box. Change the opacity, or you can hide it. I'll leave it on. And the next one is focus step, and we looked at this one earlier, which showed the different values of the steps for fine and coarse control using these buttons or the keyboard shortcuts. Now focus peaking shows the areas of the image that are in focus. So if I click on visible, so ControlMyNikon looks for areas of the image with the highest possible contrast and says that those images are in focus. So if I look closely here, we could see that it has put this yellow line around this very high contrast area, and a little bit here, a little bit here. There's some adjustments that we can make here. So first is the threshold. So this is basically the sensitivity to the calculation. If we bring it all the way back to the left, this is just incorrect. Some scenes you may need to do that, but in a high key scene like this, you can just adjust the threshold to an area that we know is correctly in focus. Okay, that's pretty close. Now you can also change the opacity of those markings, and you could change the color. Okay, let's leave it at this yellow. Now this is useful if you have someone that is doing focus pulling, or you need at a glance to see which areas are in focus. I'm going to turn this off. I'll close it. Let's take a look at the grid. So we'll make it visible, and by default it's just a 2-line by 2-line grid, so it divides it up into thirds. So if you're doing rule of thirds, you could put things in your composition at these intersections, and you could change the color of your grid. Let's make it red. You could change the opacity of the lines so they're not quite as intrusive. Bring it back to full opacity here. And you can increase the number of lines. So this is the horizontal lines and the vertical lines. If you went all the way back to the left on both these sliders, you're just going to be left with a crosshair. And I'll just bring it up by 1. Okay, that's the grid. So I'm just going to turn that off. Let's take a look at the inner and outer exposures. Now these are useful if you need a quick indicator of which areas in your composition have the correct exposure, because it is using exposure data from live view, again, it's really only useful if your live view is reporting the correct exposure data to you, which not all bodies do. However, the D800 does. So let's take a look a little closer at this. So I'm just going to enable the inner exposure. Now, exposure values are between 0 and 255. So if I wanted to see an area of exposure that was between, let's say, 168 and 173, this shows it right here. So this area in white is in that luminance area, and I'm just going to bring up the histogram here for a moment. There's not a lot of dynamic range here. We're really looking at a slice of data here that's right in this peak on the histogram. So this inner exposure is often used in when you're doing broadcast video to ensure that faces are in the correct exposure range. So in that situation, you might set it up between maybe 125 and 150 to ensure that the faces are in the correct exposure. And you can change the opacity of this and also which data channel is being used. So right now we're using the luminance channel, and here's red, green channel, and the blue channel. Okay, I'll put it back to luminance. Now we can also do an outer exposure, and here you want to see all the exposures that are below or above a particular value. So here I've set it up to show red when the values are really dark or really bright. So this shows you areas which may get close to being unacceptably under or overexposed. And I could change this a bit. See if I bring this number higher, well, there's more areas now qualify for this marking in red. If I bring it lower, it tightens up the selection criteria. So typically I'll have this set at about 10 or 11 for the low and about 245 for the high. Gives you a buffer of about a value of 10 on the upper and lower ends of the exposure scale. And you could change the channel here as well. And I'll leave it at luminance. Okay, let's turn this off. On to other things. Labels. You may have seen earlier when we captured an image that it said something up here. Let's try it again. Capturing. Okay, so sometimes you'll get different messages up here. Now you can control the color of that. So this is only really needed to make it a little bit easier to read. It depends on the scene. If the scene was a grayish scene with a lot of white in it, that wouldn't stand out very well. So what we can do instead here is just select the color, and I'm just holding my left mouse button down as I slide the mouse back and forth here. Let's find a good color. Let's go with that. Now we can also control the opacity of the background. Let's go with that. Bit of an odd color, but it should show up pretty good. If you just wait a moment, it'll go away. Now let's try it. Okay, so that's labels. Let's take a look at ISO pinning. Now the ISO pinning is only used on the D800 and D800E and the D4 and the D4S. ISO pinning is used to help deal with the problem of live view being too dark. And we've talked about this type of thing a little already. Some cameras, when in live view, will show the actual exposure. And because I have such a brightly lit scene here with continuous lighting, I could see things very easily. I mean, I have had to decrease my ISO and set things so it's not blown out. But if you're in a studio, say with your D800, and you have strobes hooked up and you don't have continuous lighting, everything's going to look too dark. You could have a model out there and you can barely see her in live view because your modeling lights just will not light up the scene adequately to be able to see it in live view. So Nikon has released updated firmware for some of these bodies, so this isn't as much of a problem anymore. But this often requires you to hold a button down on the body, which really isn't practical if you're using a tethered live view. We have a workaround here called ISO pinning. And the way ISO pinning works is to allow you to see the image at a higher ISO while in live view. Then when you capture the shot, it brings the ISO back down to the nice low value that you normally shoot at. Then when you go back to live view, it increases ISO again so you can see what you're doing. I'll demonstrate by turning off the lights here on this particular scene. Okay, now the softbox lights have been turned off and the overhead light in the room has been turned on, which is actually kind of a pretty bright light, but still we can't see what we're doing here. If this is your model, you really can't properly compose and ensure you have good focus on this live view screen. Now the reason it's really dark is because I'm going to shoot at 100 ISO. And you can go 200 ISO, but the point of the low ISO in this case is I don't want much noise in my final image. So to help brighten this up a little bit, I'm going to click on Enable by ISO pinning. And now it brightens the image. We have the slider here to make the image darker or lighter. Now what that is actually doing behind the scenes is changing the ISO of the camera. We're still going to capture this image at ISO 100, but we're going to view it at a higher ISO just so we can see what we're doing. And this is really just a workaround some of these firmware limitations. But now we can see the model, we can compose. It's real noisy because it's dark and we're really having to crank the ISO up to be able to see this, but it allows us to work with it. So now if I capture the image, we're going to capture it at 100. So let's try it. Take the shot. Of course, if I capture it at 100, it's going to be quite dark because I don't have any strobes in this particular demo. Now if I go to the browser and look at it, we could see that it was captured at ISO 100 and is very dark. And if your strobes would have fired here, you would have been just fine. But back in live view, it's still nice and bright. Let's take another shot. And behind the scenes, what it's doing, when you click on the capture button, it is dropping the ISO to 100, capturing the image, increasing it back up nice and high to where you had before so you could see things again in live view. Drops the ISO, increases the ISO. So really this is just a workaround for those firmware limitations. Okay, lights are back up. And let's take a look at overlays. Now you can use a JPEG or a raw image to overlay on top of the live view image. So if you took that LVBMP and converted it in another app to say a JPEG, you can overlay it here. But I'm just going to load up one of our previous images and overlay it. So I'll make it visible and then I'll browse for the file. And I'm going to browse for the first shot we took. Should be this one. And now I'll adjust the opacity. And you can see it's exactly the same. Now I'm just going to move the camera a little bit and we'll see what happens. So now if I go like this, this is the current composition, the live view image. I just move the camera a little bit. So if I load the overlay, it's back in its original composition, centered here on the screen. Now you can use this to help you align shots. So you may want to take one shot today of maybe something out there, come back a month later and line it up and do it again. You can load the previous image into live view and then just move your camera around until everything matches perfect. And once it matches, take the next shot, and now you kind of have like a time lapse over a long time. I'm going to try moving the camera now so these two line back up. So that's live view. There's a lot of functionality there to make you a more efficient and precise photographer. Happy tethering.